Hello, and welcome to episode 140 of Public Interest Podcast with your host, Jordan Cooper, where we interview politicians, activists, advocates, and others who seek to improve the state of the world. We're here today with Nancy Navarro, Montgomery County Council member representing District 4, former president of the Montgomery County Council, former president of the Board of Education for Montgomery County Public Schools, co-founder of the Montgomery County nonprofit Village, leader of Latino Civic Project, the former executive co-director and co-founder of Centro Familia for 8 years, an economic and educational development center for Latinos and other immigrant women in Montgomery County, and a former member of the White House Commission on Educational Excellence for Hispanics. Nancy, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing today?
Doing very good, very good. Thank you for having me.
Excellent. The first question I'd like to pose to you is, what are you currently doing, or what have you ever done to advance the public interest, and why?
Wow. So I think that, there are many levels I think that you can advance the public interest. I think that for me it really started when my oldest daughter, who's now 24, entered kindergarten. And it was very clear to me that it was going to be truly important to participate in the educational system in Montgomery County, but also look out for interests, especially of children of color and many immigrant moms who didn't speak English very well. And it sort of started that way. So I started doing a lot of mentoring and volunteering in that capacity. That led to the thought of creating this nonprofit organization to assist mostly Latino women to become licensed family child care providers, thinking of how that would help them economically, but also assist in preparing especially Latino children and other immigrant children to enter school ready to learn. We know that the academic achievement gap really is already present in kindergarten. So I feel like that was another way that I was seeking to advance public interest. And that led to an opportunity to run for the Board of Education for an appointment because there had been a resignation.
Right.
Thinking that I could then expand much more that universe of striving to make a difference and make a contribution. And then that led to the Montgomery County Council. I mean, once again, tragically, the council member that represented District 4, Miriam Preisner, passed away. And I left this seat open, which I ran for, and then I was elected in 2009. And of course, now that expands the whole entire gamut, because at the Board of Education, you're very much focused on on educational policy. But obviously, Montgomery County Council is the council that has a very broad charter. There are 9 of us, and we can add or subtract to the almost $5.2 billion budget. We make all the land use decisions for the county. And of course, we are the legislative branch, so we pass laws. So now it's an opportunity to broadly contribute to all the issues that affect residents in this extraordinary county.
So it sounds like you really were able to initially get involved in local politics through your child and as a business owner. Are those still identities that you hold today that you attempt to serve? I know you have been involved in the Latino Civic Project. Perhaps you can elaborate on that project and how you're using it to serve families and also immigrant families.
Yeah, the entrepreneurial spirit is very much present, as we all know, in the immigrant community. My husband started his company in the basement of our home, and now it's a company that, employs over 150 folks. And when I launched Centro Familia, for me, that was also really, attempting to be entrepreneurial, because you're launching an organization from scratch and then you're employing folks, but you're also helping immigrant women become their own business owners. To this day, we also launched a network called Leonas, which was an association that still is functioning today. The Latino Family Child Care Association is still alive and well. Many of these women that went to Centro Familia are running their businesses still very successfully. So to me, that was a way of multiplying and offering the technical assistance, the mentoring, the training necessary for many of these women to become self-sufficient and to actually be able to employ others. The Latino Civic Project is a little bit different. In 2011, the boundaries of my district, redistricting occurred. And for the first time, I started representing an area that had a very high percentage of Latino residents. And that led me to recognize that, as long as I had been involved in public service, when I look out into the audience every time there's a public hearing, I don't necessarily see this community represented, right? Even when we're making decisions that directly affect Latino community, like ESOL services or any other kind of services that might be particular to that community, barely ever do you see people involved. And it dawned on me that it really has everything to do with the lack of civic education,
Uh-huh.
the basics. It's not that folks are not interested in participating or wouldn't want to come and share their opinion.
Right.
It's that they just didn't have the tools and just the ABCs of how do you get involved in a civic process in local government. And so I hired someone that I had actually hired through Centro Familia, believe it or not, who was really an organic organizer, and she developed a curriculum which we are imparting in Title I schools in my district, and we have seen an incredible rise in people participating in council hearings, in Board of Education hearings. I also, because I chair the Government Operations Committee of the council, have made proposals to structurally increase the way that we communicate with, especially communities who are underrepresented. So now we have a bilingual Spanish-speaking communication specialist. We have another communication specialist that broadly addresses issues of the Asian community writ large. We have English subtitles on our screens if somebody comes and testifies in their language. If people let us know ahead of time, we have simultaneous interpretation. And this is to really allow and facilitate the participation of all members of all residents of the county in their local decision-making process.
I'm wondering about the Latino community in Montgomery County. Many of them, and correct me if I'm wrong, may have been fleeing sites of civil unrest in Central and South America. And they came here as somewhat asylum seekers or political refugees fleeing violence. I'm wondering if any of those immigrants or immigrant families, perhaps the young people learning from the generation who actually immigrated, have some kind of fear of government, of state government, and of registering or of showing up, because perhaps maybe in Central America, if you showed up to a rally or something, you may get arrested and may disappear. So I'm wondering if that fear, that cultural background, may have contributed to any extent to people's lack of civic engagement in Montgomery County. And if that is a true hypothesis, how have you been able to overcome that?
Yeah, well, that is an absolute fact. Okay, in the 1980s, we saw the rise, the increase in the Latino community in the metropolitan region from 1980 to the year 2010. It was a 700% increase. And it was obviously as a result of people fleeing the wars in Central America in the 1980s. And so there is no doubt there has always been a level of mistrust. And I think there's been several levels, right? There are folks who are coming from Latin America who are also maybe not fleeing a war, but they're definitely fleeing dysfunctional governments where there's no such thing as a functional local government that responds to your needs. Okay,
right.
That just doesn't exist. And so in some instances, it's just the lack of a familiarity with a system that actually works. And in other instances, like you were describing, it's a matter of life and death. And so you have all those elements that play into this sentiment of just not trusting, not thinking that it's worth your time, worrying about possible consequences. And, to me, that's why it's so important for people who represent, who reflect these communities to run for office.
Right.
It's never really easy. I mean, I came here when I was very young. I came here first when I was 10 years old because my father was attending graduate school in Missouri. So I learned English then. I was here for 2 years. Went back to Venezuela, and then came back as a 17-year-old freshman going to University of Missouri, Columbia. And so my experience was different, but at the same time, it was very difficult for me to take the step to run for office, right? It had never been something that I had really, thought about or contemplated in the United States. And, but, it makes a big difference when I am able to communicate directly to this community and explain the importance of being involved, the importance of participating, why this is important for your children, the fact that there's a system here that does work. And I always refer to that. I always say, perhaps in our countries of origin, this doesn't happen, this doesn't occur, but here you have that opportunity, you have that chance. And the way that I've seen it change is that, you're never going to get a massive amount of folks coming, but you always get a number of people who are organic leaders in those communities.
Right.
They happen usually to be women, to be honest. But anyway, and then they participate. They come to a hearing, right? They testify, and then they see that their testimony had a direct impact in that vote. Well, then they become the ambassadors in their communities, right? And they spread the word and say, this is incredible. Look what we did. Look what we accomplished. That's how you build this awareness and this trust. So it's not from the bottom down, right? The role that local government can play in what we're doing is very, in a way, unique. I don't think there's been a council member in the past that has launched a civic project like this for its constituents. But the reality is that we can provide that. We can provide the education, the access, the infrastructure. At the end of the day, the community has to have positive experiences that then they can relay, and then that multiplies. Also, we have this phenomenon already in this area, this county, of second and third generation immigrants. And so, these are young people, for example, who have never lived in Central or Latin America, who've grown up here, who are, Americans 100% culturally and, in terms of bilingual and bicultural. And so we need to also figure out how to involve the second and third generation in a way that they find it relevant and worth their time. And I think that in many ways we're grappling with that, right? I think in terms of, both parties, in terms of just political process, how do we engage every segment along? So it's a fascinating, I think, challenge. But we've seen extraordinary results, and my hope is that, once I leave office, that this structure remains in place, because it is absolutely critical if we want to address a lot of the disparities that still exist. We have got to involve the communities affected.
You speak about engaging second and third generation immigrants. Now, a lot of those individuals fall into the category of millennials born between 1980 and 1995. So is there any difference between trying to target millennials? And remember, historically, throughout the latter half of the 20th century, individuals in their 20s and young 30s are less likely to turn out to participate in local government, regardless of what generation you're in. Obviously, you had slightly higher rates of participation during Vietnam or World War II because of the draft, but generally, people in their 20s participate less than older people, regardless of which generation. Is there any difference between reaching out to the Latinos who are in the second and third generation immigrants who are millennials and just millennials at large?
I would only say that the one thing that's interesting about the Latino community is sort of this really strong family cohesion. And so usually we send that message to the parents. When the parents are going through these civic meetings, or when we're working in the schools and we know that the children are there, or they're young adults, etc. We always say, you have got to bring your young millennial to vote. You've got to bring them out to these meetings. You need to make sure you tell them, and so it's a way also that it becomes a family tradition and family values. And I did that with my children. I mean, they're now 20 and 24, and ever since they were young, I would bring them to vote with me. I would explain things to them, and so I've seen how that just becomes sort of a family value that you hold dear. So that is really important, because if the parents are saying, hey, this is our country, we've got to participate. You cannot, just give up your right to vote like that. It makes a difference. I think that's a really wonderful way of targeting that message. There's also media, and I mean, there's been a lot of media that I've seen shifting to ensure that they're targeting the millennial, the Latinx, generation millennials, with messages that hopefully will also, promote that interest in participating.
Now, I'd like to speak for a moment on the differences between Latinos and Latinas. You mentioned that a lot of times in your audience, you find more women attending your civic engagement. You yourself are a Latina. I'm wondering, perhaps that could make sense, or it could be counterintuitive, right? Are these women, who's making dinner? Who's taking care of the children? Are they bringing children to the event? Is the little appetizers in the beginning in lieu of dinner? Don't the women have jobs as well as the men? I mean, obviously, you don't want to stereotype, but if the majority of your audience is female, and of course you became a natural leader in your community through the PTSA and taking care of the children, the Parent Teachers Association, can you speak a little bit about why you may find Latina women perhaps becoming a little bit more involved more quickly than Latino men?
It's a very good question, and I really have not spent too much time analyzing that, other than because my work with Centro Familia, of course, these were women who were becoming family childcare providers, mostly in the demographic breakup of, childcare providers tend to skew to women. So there was that component. There was the sense that women really hold a very, I would say, important role in the household in this community in terms of decision making. But it is true that it's also counterintuitive because there's always this stereotype, right, that Latino women are, shy and subservient and all of this stuff. When in reality, pretty much they're constantly there leading the way, and they're constantly there leading the way for their children. I always say that, my father was, I guess, quite a feminist, even though I never thought about it, because I'm the oldest, and I was 17 when I decided to come to the United States by myself to go to college. And he was my biggest supporter. My mother was having, a conniption, but my dad was my biggest supporter. And it was, they raised 3 daughters and a son, but they raised us to believe and know that you can just achieve anything, that you're not better or less, than anybody. And so I don't know, there is an interesting dynamic there. And I think that, a lot of women get involved because of the school and education of their children.
Right.
And then naturally from there, they start realizing that there are other policy decisions that affect the quality of life of the family, right? So after, they kind of deal with education, they start saying, but wait a second, what about there's trash in my neighborhood. How can we get rid of that? There's not enough transportation. There's not enough after-school activities. What about the recreation centers in my area? And so then all of a sudden, you start seeing the widening of interest areas. And I think that's really awesome, So however we get into many of these communities, I'm fine. Doesn't mean that we don't have men participating. We do.
Yeah, of course.
But the majority seem to be women right now.
So you mentioned that one key element of getting Latinos and Latinas involved in local government is showing that they can be effective, that their voice actually matters, that when they come and testimony and that testimony actually shifts a vote on a piece of legislation, they see that their vote actually works. But of course, as an elected official, you know that a lot of times votes are determined ahead of time by testimony, or you kind of know where you're going to land based on your constituency, based on your values, based on your relationships with other legislators and who introduces it and what the county executive wants. And obviously you have to take into account a lot of different testimony, but a lot of times when you're holding hearings for legislation, you have a good idea of how it's going to actually end up shaking out when it comes to a final vote. And sometimes that may not be in line with how those constituents are, what they're advocating for. So it's clear that if they come and advocate and then you end up changing your mind and voting as they had hoped you would vote, that would clearly make them an ambassador and make them feel empowered. But there may also be times when they come and testify and they're not successful, and it may not have anything to do with their testimony, but that may be the outcome and they may not be happy with it. How do you keep them encouraged? How do you keep them coming back? How do you keep them from from just saying, you know what, I knew my voice wouldn't matter and it didn't?
One thing we have found out is that just being in a room that is packed with, members, with the residents and constituents from different parts of the county, from different communities, hearing the pros and cons and the different arguments that everybody is presenting, that in itself has become a real positive on both sides. I also, it was amazing to see the faces of people who were, non-Latinos, right? People who were born and raised in the United States or have come here, and maybe some of them come here a lot to testify. And when they were hearing the testimony of these Latino residents, and because they could read the subtitles on the screen, they started realizing they had a lot in common, right? And many times we're talking about neighborhoods where people may have lived, next to each other and had never had a conversation because the perceptions of the barrier of language or, cultural differences, we all want the same thing, right? And so even in instances where it may not turn out exactly the way they want it, just being part of that process and seeing how people take the time to come and how people debate the issues, it's already such a rewarding experience that it continues to motivate. Nonetheless, there was a particular, incident with a historic preservation vote where a group of these, moms mostly went to the planning department, testified in front of the Historic Preservation Commission, and then came here for the final vote. And that wasn't a done deal whatsoever. But I think when my colleagues realized that these residents who were going to be directly affected by this vote because it was in their neighborhood took the time to come out with a very specific unified message, and this was all on their own. It actually flipped some votes. And it actually was a 9-0 to oppose the historic preservation designation because it would have derailed this very important Wheaton Library Recreation Department, Recreation Center project.
Yeah.
And so they got and that was really quite an amazing, accomplishment for that group of folks.
So I'd like to transition to your story, Nancy, and how you got involved. You began to get involved with the Parent-Teacher Association because you cared about your daughter's education in Montgomery County Public Schools. But of course, many individuals volunteer in their child's PTA, but not too many of them end up becoming a Montgomery County Council member. First, you became president. Can you speak about your path, your transition from being an advocate for your child in the educational arena to being a leader of the PTA, and how that led to being on the Board of Education? At what point did it occur to you, you know what, maybe I ought to run for office, and how did you end up treading that path?
I will have to be completely honest. I tried really hard when my daughter was in elementary school to be a part of the PTA, and it just didn't speak to me.
Mm-hmm.
And so then I made the strategic decision to become a classroom volunteer. I was a classroom bilingual volunteer because she was in the Spanish immersion program. And I got to see firsthand a lot of things and just really focused on my daughter, but then also realizing, how things work and
mm-hmm.
how the education system was functioning here, et cetera. When she went into middle school,
mm-hmm.
I was pretty much drafted to be president of the White Oak PTSA. Actually, I think we were co-presidents. And it was one of those things where I said, I need to go to the PTSA, meeting was the first one, and they didn't have a leadership group. And so I was just kind of drafted, and I started working with them.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, I was also a member of the Long Branch Revitalization Task Force,
mm-hmm.
and I was chair of the Children's Schools and Child Care Work Group. That opened my eyes to many things, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I was doing that work. I was working on issues of child care, realizing the importance of early education in the academic achievement later on,
mm-hmm.
then working in the school system, through my role as a volunteer as a PTSA. And so when there was a resignation at the Board of Education,
mm-hmm.
For the first time ever, I knew somebody that was running for the board. It was somebody that I had just really met, but had, really admired,
mm-hmm.
which was former Councilmember Valerie Irvin.
Mm-hmm.
And I had never been involved in anything regarding politics or anything, but I thought, I'd like to have a coffee for her. So we organized the coffee in my neighborhood for her.
Mm-hmm.
And that day, she literally turned to me and said, did you see that there was a resignation in the Board of Education? I had just moved to Colesville.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh, yeah, wow, that's really amazing. She said, it's in your district. You live here. It's like, it is your representative. And I was like, oh, my goodness. Well, And then a couple of people turned to me and said, you should run for this, And it was interesting because I had to really look at what I had been doing for
mm-hmm.
such a long time, right? And it was as if I had laid out a path
right.
to run for this seat. But I had never, ever contemplated it. And the thing that moved me across that sort of threshold
mm-hmm.
was the notion that I had started to get frustrated and anxious, a little bit about, and impatient, I should say, about just being on this side of the table,
mm-hmm.
constantly trying to make the case for all these issues, begging for money, right? And at some point I just said, you know what? I want to be on that other side of the table, where I can make certain decisions, make a contribution that is much more direct. And that's what pushed me over the threshold to decide to run for the seat, knowing absolutely nothing about running for office or anything, and just, put together a plan with friends and executed it. And so it was in a very organic way, I guess, that I arrived there. Same thing when I ran for the Montgomery County Council. It was a very organic issue. I had not really been part of the Democratic Party machinery or
mm-hmm.
the infrastructure or anything like that. But I could see that there was a need for a certain perspective at the county council level as well, having been so successful, I think, in working with my colleagues at the Board of Education. Really felt that it was time to expand that. So it was a very organic, I think, path, but I learned a lot along the way, and I'm very, very committed to this notion of sharing as much as I can about, the lessons learned and mentoring and grooming, especially young people that might be interested in this.
So as we approach the end of the podcast, I'd like to ask you a final question. You ended up being drafted to run for the Board of Education. You ended up finding a vacancy and running for Montgomery County Council. But one thing that many listeners may be thinking is, well, and I want them to really hear this story, is that you managed to balance it all, right? You still needed to bring in money. You still needed to take care of the kids, pay the rent. You were a business owner. You were a nonprofit founder, right? And how much does the PTA pay? It pays nothing, right? You're a volunteer. And how much does a campaign cost?